Welcome back in for the Blacksburg Buzz. Today we're getting into the schedule deep dive, part 5. We're talking about Syracuse and Clemson coming up on the schedule. Two pretty tough teams. Obviously, Clemson up there in the rankings are number 15 right now, and Syracuse faring pretty well so far this season as well. So it's going to be two tough ones for the Hokies, and they're really going to have to play up to their full potential to leave with 2 wins over the course of these 2 weeks. Now, before we talk about these two games and the players you need to watch and a few notes on the schedule and the teams themselves, let's talk about today's video sponsor, BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200K. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here. So with Syracuse to start off, this will be game 9 of Virginia Tech's season, and they're currently sitting at 3-1. Now, the Orange, they have a pretty easy schedule so far, and interestingly enough, 2 early conference games, which is a little bit odd at this point in the year. They played Georgia Tech, who's pretty good, but definitely a little bit overrated as a ranked team when the Orange did defeat the Yellow Jackets. And they also played Stanford, which was the other ACC team. And Stanford's expected to be one of the lower tier ACC teams this season. And so far, they've kind of showed that. So, not a very difficult schedule for Syracuse thus far. Now, last season, they were okay, 6-7 with a bowl loss. But wow, that was an ugly bowl game. So rough. I mean, 45-0. USF took the Boca Raton Bowl. That's got to be on par with Florida State's loss to Georgia last season after basically having their entire team opt out and enter the transfer portal after things went awry with the college football playoff. But, I mean, Syracuse, they didn't really beat anyone good last year. I think legitimately their best win might have been Army. They had some pretty tough teams on their schedule that they lost to, and then they beat some of the lower tier teams on their schedule, so not really anything unexpected or out of the ordinary there. Just a pretty decent group overall. Now, in terms of the players to watch, Kyle McCord, the quarterback, is really one of the standouts and looks to be like a pretty solid quarterback in the ACC, a 154 passer rating. He's got 14 touchdowns to 5 interceptions this season, and he's averaging 364 yards per game. Now, I know that yards per game doesn't exactly quantify everything perfectly because, if you play an easier team, you're probably going to have more yardage. If you play a tougher team, you might have less, or sometimes you just have a great game and you need to throw the ball more, or you're way ahead and you run the ball a lot more, even though you're playing super well. So it doesn't really take all that into account, but still a pretty solid number there for McCord. And he's a good quarterback, but he doesn't get a lot of yardage on the ground. He's only gained 50 yards, but a minus 16 net this season. So a little bit of a liability there, and that's one area where Virginia Tech's probably going to be looking to attack. When you've got a quarterback who can't run and scramble quite as effectively, it takes one dimension out of the game. It makes things just that much easier for your defense. That's going to be a big point in this game, is just trying to limit McCord and the wide receivers. Now, before we get to the wide receivers, though, really good running back for Syracuse, Alan LeQuint, 287 yards. He's averaging 5.3 per carry and about 72 per game. He is the only back with over 20 touches this season. So most guys are sitting in the tens or the single digits, and he's got 54. Clearly the number one option for the Orange, and he's also been active receiving-wise as well. The second most catches on the team, for 168 additional yards on top of that 287. So you're sitting in the low to mid 400s there. He really does it all for this team. And if there's anyone to worry about, it's going to be him. The defense needs to be aware of LeQuint at all times during this game because he does everything for them. He is really just pulling their team through. I mean, there are some receivers with good stats, but nothing in comparison to the running back. I mean, he is doing it all for the Orange. Very impressive stuff from him. There's also Trevor Pena, wide receiver. I believe it's Pena. 26 catches for 316 yards and 5 touchdowns. He leads the team in all 3 categories. So clearly wide receiver 1 right here. He's getting the workload. He's getting the yardage. He's getting, the goal line throws as well. Really got to watch out for it here. I imagine Dorian Strong will probably be matched up with him, which does fare well for the Hokies when you've got 2 great corners like that. I mean, it makes it tough on opposing wide receivers. A pretty solid defense for Virginia Tech. And, the receivers, they'll have their work cut out for them for the Orange. There's also Jackson Meeks, wide receiver, 19 catches for 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's got quite a bit of size, 6'2", 210. So potentially when we get into some, jump balls, 50-50 balls, some tough catches, I think his size will play into that well. So they might look for him if things aren't working too well and try and lob him up something, see if he can get vertical and grab it. You've also got Umari Hatcher, very explosive guy, 18 yards per catch. He's got a 67-yard season long. Just 12 receptions so far this year, but 218 yards. That's pretty insane. So they're big, explosive guy, and you're going to have to be looking for him as a deep threat. Don't let Hatcher get into open space. For Syracuse, they've got a pretty good offense. They're averaging almost 34 points per game, which is pretty impressive. But the real drawback is they allow quite a bit too. Now, when you think about how early we are in the season, and who Syracuse has played so far, opponents are averaging 22.5 points per game, which doesn't seem too bad, but you allow 22 to Miami, Ohio, 28 to Georgia Tech, 26 to Stanford with the loss, and 14 to Holy Cross. I'm a little bit concerned about this defense when conference play really heats up. Now, they've played 2 conference games, but still, you've got some tough ones on the schedule. They've got ranked UNLV coming up, and I think that's going to be a really good game to get a better expectation out of this team for the season. They've got some tough conference opponents, which shockingly include Boston College and Cal, believe it or not, but also Miami to close the year. So some very tough games ahead of them, and it's really tough to get a good gauge on the defense at this point in the year. I think that UNLV game is going to be pretty important to see how their defense actually fares. Now, before the game, I'm thinking Virginia Tech is sitting at a record of about 5-3. I really think this team is going to bounce back after Miami, potentially win 3 straight. But I'm not sure how I feel about Syracuse being a decent team overall. But I'm not totally bought in on the Orange either. I mean, they did lose to Stanford after all, so I'm not super bought into this team. Now, if they beat UNLV and, convincingly, my pick is the Orange. I'm going with Syracuse. If not, I'm still leaning towards Syracuse, but much closer to a toss-up, maybe just barely. But the main reason I'd be giving them the edge is Virginia Tech is notoriously bad on the road. 4-11 in road games during the last 3 seasons under Pry. Just not great outside of home. And JMA also isn't the easiest place to play at. I know people can have difficulties there, so I'm tending to lead towards Syracuse on this one, which would put Tech at 5-4 after game number 9 of the season. Now, looking at the Clemson game, 3-1, and ranked number 15 this year. They're a great team, and they're going to have another great season. Legitimately, I think they can win out. By far, the toughest game on the schedule left is Louisville for them, whose only loss is to Notre Dame so far this season. Louisville, I believe they're sitting around the 20 mark right now, so just a little bit below Clemson, but another great team in the ACC. Clemson went 9-4 last season with a couple of interesting losses, but they're good enough to beat just about anyone and just about anyone on their schedule. They've got a very interesting method of refraining from anybody in the transfer portal. It's definitely hurt them over the last few years, but they're still hanging in the rankings, and I think that's pretty impressive. Now, you got to be aware of Cade Klubnik, the quarterback, highly efficient. Klubnik has 12 touchdowns this season to 2 interceptions, and he's mobile as well. 106 rushing yards this season and 4 touchdowns on the ground. Klubnik has the third most carries on the team and the second most rushing yards on the team, interestingly enough. We already know how the dual threat quarterback has caused the Hokies some issues. They've played a couple of great ones like Pavia, like Cam Ward so far this season, and Clemson just has so many ways to attack you offensively. This is yet another one. Could cause them a little bit of trouble just with so many different options to go to. When one's not working, you try something different, and they've got a lot of different things to try. There's also Phil Maffa, the running back. He has over 1/3 of the total carries on the team. Clearly the workhorse back for the Tigers. 43 attempts, 342 yards, 2 touchdowns. Insane stuff out of Maffa. Stopping the run is paramount against Clemson. They can attack you through the air, but you cannot let Phil Maffa run all over you because he will. They will give him 20 touches. They'll do it. If that wins the game, I think Dabo will do whatever it takes, and he's got a great running back to do it. Looking at the wide receivers, Antonio Williams, pretty small young receiver, but he's got good numbers so far. 16 catches, 196 yards, and 3 touchdowns. The most catches on the team, second most yards, and he just keeps the sticks moving frequently for them. It doesn't seem like he has a lot of big plays, but when you're just racking up catches and adding yards slowly over time, he's going to keep moving the offense and keep them on schedule moving down the field. That's important. You got to have a guy to do that, and I think that's Antonio Williams. Then there's Jake Brenningstool, a tight end, just a monster. 6'6", 240. He'll be tough to tackle, and I imagine he blocks great too. Third most in yards on the team with 163, just a few catches behind Williams. This dude is going to be tough to take down with that huge frame. Virginia Tech has some great defenders, but if you let him get ahead of steam, could be a little bit rough for the defense there. Just a big dude. It's tough to take down a 6'6", 240 guy, even when you're a college football player. There's also Bryant Westco Jr., another wide receiver, and once again, another young stud, 6'2", 180. He's the most explosive guy on this team. Just 7 catches on the season, but 238 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's 34 yards per catch. Absolutely insane. Wesco is a deep threat for sure. Luckily, Virginia Tech has a great set of corners. My only worry is who's on who, because with so many weapons on this team, it's going to be tough. You only have so many defenders to spread around, and you'd like to have your strongest guys on the strongest receivers. But with Clemson, it really seems like they've got a lot of strength, a lot of depth around. I'm only naming really the top couple of guys, but there are plenty other dudes on Clemson's team that can really attack you in many different ways. These are just the ones that I think are really, really the top-notch guys on offense that you're going to know by name and you really need to be aware of. But so many different weapons a lot of depth on this team. It's going to be tough. This will be a tough game. Clemson, they're just a great team. Honestly, it's amazing that they can avoid the portal and still be relevant in college football, although they're not the utter powerhouse that they were with Trevor Lawrence. It's still impressive that they're holding up this well after a couple of years in no portal and with all the NIL stuff going on. You got to give your props to Clemson. They're still a great team, just an interesting coaching methodology from Dabo. It certainly hurt them, but definitely not taking them off the map. I feel pretty comfortable calling this the second toughest game of the season. If the Hokies play like they did in Miami, I actually think maybe they win this game. But that's a big if. It's at home, which does help a lot. I don't see Virginia Tech blowing Clemson away, though, and that's scary. The staff has not proved that they can win close games yet. I believe it's 1-10 in one-score games under Pry. Virginia Tech would really need to reach new heights to go above that 7-point ceiling, but maybe this is a game where they can turn it around. We did see just a big turning point against Miami. You still lose the game, a heartbreaker that I talked about in the last episode, but you showed a lot of resolve. You worked your way back. You played a good game, and after a tough 4 games this season, you play a really good one against a really good team. That's huge. The heartbreaker, it's tough for the locker room, it's tough for the staff, it's tough for the fans. But if you keep that momentum going into Stanford and you come up with a big win and you just keep powering along, I think you look at it as a turning point, and by the time you get to game 10 in the season, you could be looking like a real powerhouse. Honestly, who knows? This team is very two-faced. You really never know what you're going to get. You might get the Miami day, or you might get the Vanderbilt first half. You never know what you're going to get with the Hokies. In some ways, it makes it fun. In a lot of ways, it makes you sad and it hurts, but they do have a lot of potential, and when they play to it, they're a great squad.